This chapter is on the brain and the cranial nerves. When we talk about the development of the brain, it's important to remember there are four major regions of the brain going from superior to inferior anatomically. They begin with the cerebrum, which is the various lobes, then the diencephalon, which includes places of the brain like the thalamus, the brainstem, which is things like the pons medulla, and then in the posterior region of the brain is the cerebellum. So the outer location of the outer anatomy of the cerebrum is wrinkled. I'm sure you've seen it in appearance. And those outer folds are what are called gyri for plural, gyrus for singular. And then between those folds are depressions, which are called sulci. Singular would be sulcus. Those are important depressions between the folds that separate functional regions of the brain. So the directional terms that we're going to use when describing the brain is the term rostral, which means towards the nose, and then towards the tail would be caudal. So rostral and caudal, we don't use that often, but they're kind of synonymous with the terms anterior, which means front, and posterior, which means towards the back. So we'll be using these terms when talking about different junctions of the brain. So inferior to this junction, these terms are not synonymous, but they are in this case. So we have a nice image of the human brain here. On the right-hand side, we have a superior image of the brain, specifically showing one of these important sulci, which I am drawing a red arrow to. On the left-hand side of the slide here, you can see that same sulcus looking at a lateral view of the brain. The central sulcus is going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So we would say that the frontal lobe is rostral to the parietal lobe because it's in front of. Those bumps that I mentioned are called a gyrus, and the depressions are called sulcuses, or sulci for plural, sulcus for singular. It's some of the important ones, like the central sulcus, which is going to separate important functions of the brain. Other lobes that are shown in this diagram would be the temporal lobe, the brainstem, which is the pons medulla, and midbrain, which you can't see on this image. Also, another lobe, the most posterior lobe, or caudal lobe, would be the occipital lobe. And another really important sulcus to know is the lateral sulcus. So the image to the right, again, is a cadaver image with the central sulcus being highlighted. When we look at an inferior view of the brain, we can see the cerebral hemispheres, which are shown. So there's a right brain and a left brain. These are the hemispheres. The cerebrum includes the major lobes like the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, which you can see over here. And then the parietal lobe, which you actually can't see on this diagram. The brainstem, it's important for you to know the parts of the brainstem, and they are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Another important region of the brain is the cerebellum, often associated with balance, so your ability to walk a straight line, for example. Also shown here is the olfactory tracts, which are part of the olfactory cranial nerve, and there is the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, and that crosses over to the other hemisphere at a location called the optic chiasma. On our next slide here, we see a mid-sagittal section of the brain, again showing the diencephalon, and the diencephalon has the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It also has another part of the brain, which is called the epithalamus, where the pineal gland is. So those are the three parts of the diencephalon. We also see the central sulcus. The other major lobes would be lobes like the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. The brainstem is the midbrain pons and the medulla oblongata, and then finally the cerebellum. Crossing the two hemispheres, there are a group of axons, which are, it's called a commissural network, and that is called the corpus callosum. So in the cadaver image that is to your right, it is highlighting the corpus callosum. So any of these items on the brain that I have highlighted, you want to make sure that you can identify. The brain has two major matters, and what that means is regions of the brain which appear gray and regions of the brain that appear white. Now, the reason for this color is due to the degree of myelination, which you've learned about previously in nervous tissue. White matter has myelinated axons, and it's deep to the gray matter of the cortex. The most superficial region of the brain has gray matter, which is motor neurons, interneuron cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. So this forms the cerebral cortex, and the word cortex means that it covers the surface. Within the white matter, there are islands of gray matter that are clusters of neuron cell bodies called cerebral nuclei. For example, the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, has neuron cell bodies and is a collection of cerebral nuclei. So in this frontal or coronal section, we can see gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is on the left, and you can see it's the outer cerebral cortex, which is where all of these outer bumps are. So when we look at the outside of the brain, they appear as gyri. Deep to this gray matter is cerebral nuclei. So that would be these various collections that you see. In fact, the one that I just pointed out is called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is actually, I'm sorry, right here. This is cerebral nuclei. The corpus callosum is right here connecting both hemispheres. And it connects the two hemispheres so that they can communicate with one another. Other examples of white matter include the inner white matter and internal capsule. You don't need to be able to identify either of those two, but you should be able to identify the corpus callosum.